Amen. I'm trying to find my pen. Anybody have a ballpoint pen? I usually have one. Oh, nice. Okay. I like to make little notes as I go. So Matthew chapter 15. We are piggybacking off of where Chester was last week. I honestly got back super late Sunday night and have been crammed. I haven't had a chance to watch it. But I do know that leading up Chester last week, I flipped open my Bible to make sure I knew what scripture that was. And I immediately was like, I don't think I knew that was what the scripture was. So it was an interesting one, the crumbs off the master's table. I'm excited to hear your take on that, Chester, and I'm double grateful that I didn't have to teach it. So thank you for stepping in and teaching well last week. We're going to be Matthew chapter 15. Let's just read it, jump right in, and see what we can pull from the scripture tonight. Jesus went on from there. So he was in the region of Tyre and Sidon, very Gentile area, and now he's going back to what I would call like his home base. And he walked beside the Sea of Galilee. And he went up on the mountain and he sat down there. And great crowds came to him, bringing with them the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others. And they put them at his feet, and he healed them, so that the crowd wondered. Linda, you grooving?
I'm sorry.
She's grooving over here. It's like somebody playing the piano in someone's purse. Okay, so that the crowd wondered, and when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled healthy, and the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. I want to pause for a second. I don't know if you ever have this instinct, but I read the Bible fairly often. Anybody else in the club? But you know what happens sometimes when I read the Bible is I read quickly. I'm reading for distance. I'm reading for quantity. And I often catch myself. I think it's a product of maybe going to school for a while and thinking, oh, I got to get as many pages in. Anybody else read like that? And I feel like when I start reading like that, I usually catch myself a couple chapters in, and I feel like this weight of like, you probably missed so much. And I was thinking this week because I read this and I started to think, I got my pen and my highlighter out and I started to think like, okay, let's dig in. And I felt like this deep conviction to just stop for a second and reread slowly. And I reread slowly. And I want to encourage you actually to reread slowly because what we just read is amazing. It's so amazing that the crowd, it says, when they see it happen, they wonder. It's the same word that they are astonished or they marvel at what is happening right in front of them. And it dawned on me that as I'm reading this, I'm not being astonished by Jesus, I'm just reading. Does that make sense? So why don't you pause and read it for yourself nice and slow. And instead of just studying for distance tonight, let's start from a place of we want to be astonished by Jesus. So I'm going to give you a minute just to read nice and slow about what's going on here. Does it feel good to slow down? Jesus comes back to home base around where he found the disciples. And it says that he went up on the mountain. The idea, and most scholars are on the same page as this, is that where Jesus just sat down, he's sat down on this mountain before. Do you remember this mountain? This is the scene of the greatest sermon ever preached. But instead of Jesus going up on the mountain and people flocking to him and he begins to teach them, I want to point out something the Bible doesn't explicitly show us. Jesus doesn't speak. Do you see that? He doesn't speak this time. Everything that he's been teaching and everything he's been directing the disciples in and all the miracles are all culminating in this moment where Jesus walks up on a hillside, he sits down, and he no longer has to speak. So let's skip ahead to the last verse, because I think this bookends the last verse in just this section. It's verse 31. So he does all these healings. He doesn't speak. Matthew has him say 0 words. And just what they experience, it says, they glorified the God of Israel. Now we're going to talk about Easter in the coming weeks. We are Christian people who study the Bible, but this is a huge moment in Matthew, and we shouldn't miss it, because this is what's happening. Without speaking, these people are watching Jesus, and what they have just done is this huge crowd has identified him as the God of Israel. This is like this explosive realization. And who are these people? These are not the scholars, they're not the scribes, they're not the Pharisees, they're not the Sadducees. They're not the master's degree holders, they're not the philosophers, they're not the business owners. They are the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many like them. And it's these people who recognize that Jesus is the God of Israel. Isn't that amazing? So let's talk a little bit about what goes on here. So this is, we talked a few weeks ago, there's this unique phenomenon throughout Matthew that every time Jesus goes up on a mountain, it's like this landmark moment that we should pause. Because on a mountain, God has a long history of meeting his people on mountains. And so when Jesus comes to the mountain, this is very interesting. I actually am going to be preaching on Sunday from Exodus 24. And so I'll just give you like a little insight into Exodus 24. God says, I want you to gather 70 elders from Israel, and I want you to bring a couple unique people, and I want you to bring them to the base of the mountain. But when it's time to come meet with me, you, Moses, are the only person who's allowed to come. Now, this is an idea that's kind of embedded in all of Jewish history, that the only one allowed up there are people like Moses. Who else goes up on a mountain? Elijah. Yeah, Joshua. These are the type of people who belong on a mountain in the presence of God. This is kind of the Jewish mind. And now all of a sudden, the God of Israel is seated on a mountain, not high and mighty, speaking in thunder and fire, but just gentle to the point where these sorts of people are welcome on the mountain with him, and he heals them. So there's no talking, there's no teaching, there's no preaching. It's just nice and quiet in how Matthew narrates this. So let's talk a little bit about this. I'm not super familiar with all of these conditions. I don't know that the Bible wants us to come to the scripture and say, what diagnosis is this? I don't think that's what the Bible is trying to get at. But I do know if you do a little digging, what you'll find is you might have a question. How come there's always so many people who are described as lame, blind, crippled, and mute in the Bible? You ever notice that? Anybody just go day to day and just realize I don't notice a lot of people that I would describe as mute? Anybody? I don't think I can call to mind one person, let alone every time you flip a page. Yeah, Greg, what were you going to say?
I just thought of autistic people.
Somebody with autism. Yeah. It certainly could be. I think this is an all-encompassing term, and I think if you did a little deep dive, I think this is what a lot of people would say. A lot of people would say that in the ancient world, the poor and the needy, the health of the poor and the needy is not a top priority for the well-to-do. The reason is if you have a slave or a servant or a day laborer who gets sick and dies, do you know what you do with that person? You just replace them. That's it. So what happens is people end up eating just the same meal every single day. So there's malnutrition. There's a lot of dirty water. There's a lot of, you might know this. The poorest of the poor in the ancient world, like I think women had like a 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 chance of dying during childbirth, so a lot of like childbirth complications. So I think all of these things kind of put together all kind of add up into a lot of these conditions that we don't always see. And it's important because these types of people that we're talking about in the first century are viewed as people who are, it's not like we're being mean or nasty to them. It's that if we waste our time caring for them, then we are going to suffer too. And clearly we don't want to do that. So we just kind of cast them aside, pretend they don't exist, and move on with our life. Are you following with that? So the idea that these are the people before Jesus who is the Son of God, or at least they're coming to that conclusion, is kind of obscene. If you read through the book of Leviticus, you would find out that somebody with some type of disability is not supposed to be in the presence of God. And now all of a sudden, these are all the people in the presence of God. And they bring him, and they bring them, and they put them at his feet, which is a really cool expression. Is that an idiom? Does anybody know what an idiom actually is? I just wanted to use that word, and I realized I have no idea what that actually means. Anybody know what an idiom is? Anybody with an iPhone want to look it up? Is it just a saying? Okay.
Idiomatic expression is an expression that's, common in a language that it could even be so common it has maybe a little bit different meaning or something.
Okay.
That's what an idiom is.
Okay, so it's like something that everyone in a language group understands, but maybe like literally it doesn't make perfect sense.
Right.
Okay, so I'm going to go with idiom. So they use this idiom, at his feet. Anybody feel like they know what that means?
I picture him like sitting on a rock or something that's like raised, maybe,
Okay.
and they all come like underneath their beneath them. Or?
So kind of literally like sitting below him, like elevation-wise, they're a little lower. Okay, I could technically mean that. In the Jewish world, like Paul uses this, that he studied at the feet of a very famous rabbi. In fact, if you have time, you should go look this up. The Bible tells us that Paul studied under this guy. I might be spelling it wrong. Gamaliel. Gamaliel was actually, he has tons of things written about him outside the Bible. He's a very, very famous rabbi, and he actually studied under the most famous rabbi of basically this whole 400 or 500 year chunk, Hillel. He was a disciple of him. And so Paul is like in this succession of very famous rabbis, and he says, I sat under the feet of Gamaliel. This is when he is talking about, I was a Jew among Jews, I was circumcised, I was all of these things. I sat at the feet of He's saying, I have all kinds of things to boast about, but I will boast in what? In Jesus, in his life, death, and resurrection. Those are the only things I boasted. So this idea of at his feet, I think it could literally mean at his feet, but I think it's an idiomatic expression. Thank you, Bill Jackson. This is an expression that is, it's indicating how you see yourself in comparison to another. So to sit at someone's feet is to say, I recognize the power and the authority, the wisdom that you have, and so sitting at your feet means that everything about me is looking to you as you are greater than I am. You are someone to listen to. You are somebody to glean wisdom from. Yeah, John?
On the same note, being a right-hand man.
Yeah, oh, that's a good one. A right-hand man, yeah. Makes sense. We still say that, but I don't think that means what it used to mean. Do you guys know what that used to mean? In the ancient world, when you used the restroom and you were cleaning yourself, you used your left hand. So nobody wanted to be shaken with the left hand or approached with the left hand, so it was always the right-hand man was the best man. So that one's for free. Okay, so they come to his feet. So what it's saying is that they are recognizing immediately, even before they're healed, they are recognizing that Jesus sits in a place of authority that they do not have. So they're placed at his feet, and he healed them, so that the crowd wondered. So there's this natural awe and astonishment with what Jesus is doing. Isn't that cool? Now we've come out of a few chapters where it says like Jesus goes to his hometown and he tries to perform some miracles, but there's not a lot of faith there, right? I think the idea of the awe and the wonder is present, and I love that the awe and the wonder is present without Jesus talking. Isn't that so cool? I think Matthew wants you to notice this. And when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled healthy, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, they glorified the God of Israel. So the outcome of his miraculous healing is this, that the people recognize who he is. I think it was Will who taught a handful of weeks ago. He was saying that miracles can have your jaw hit the floor without changing your heart. That's possible. That happens in Jesus' hometown. I think what we're seeing is we're seeing miracles where people's jaw hit the floor and the lights come on and they recognize Jesus. So let's talk really briefly about these miracles. Let's see. I always thought of miracles, or was taught miracles, as kind of windows into the kingdom. So basically, the idea is, there's a famous theologian, and he said the miraculous, these sorts of things, are not the exception to the rule. That the world of sin is the exception to God's rule. And so when we see a miracle, what we're doing is we're looking through a window and we're catching a glimpse of what God's kingdom looks like. And if you're pressed right up to a window, you might not be able to see the whole thing, but you're able to see that, now that I know who God is and he's ushering in a kingdom, I now know that in his kingdom, the blind see. There's not blindness any longer. The crippled and the lame, they walk. The mute speak. And so I think Will actually said it this way. He said they're previews and pointers, which I also really like. I actually think I like that more than the windows. They're previews and they're pointers. They're previews of what the kingdom is like, and so you're getting a glimpse of what the kingdom is like, but they also point you towards the one who brings in the kingdom. So it's not just, Jesus is really awesome, he can do some cool circus tricks. It's, Jesus is really awesome, he's the one who sits on the throne of the kingdom, which is pretty amazing. Okay, so I want to pause for a second. I have a question here for you, and we'll take a couple minutes, and then maybe we can pass the mic around. It's, how do you approach Jesus with wonder and awe? How many of you would just say honestly that you approach Jesus with wonder and awe all the time? How many of you would say, now that I'm put on the spot, I'm realizing not so much? I think that's a conclusion I think I've come to in the last couple days. So the real question is, how can we stop doing that? Easter is coming. We're going to celebrate this thing where people show up to check on a dead body that's not dead. Isn't that amazing? We've kind of heard this story. It comes around every year. You guys notice that? Easter just keeps happening every year. And we hear a sermon and we read the story and we get it. Yeah, we get it. We get it. And I think if we're not careful, we're going to lose the awe and wonder that Jesus went into the grave and came back alive. Not like Lazarus, who came back to life and then probably died again. He came back to life, he stayed alive, and he gives you life. That is an awe and wonder thing. And if we're not careful, Easter is going to come. We're going to be like, cool service, great sermon, good baptisms. I was moved a little bit, beautiful, and move on with our life. So how can we incorporate more awe and wonder into our relationship with Jesus? Ready, set, go. Get close. Yeah.
Great crowds came.
What's that?
Great crowds came.
Yeah.
And so it took time. So they didn't all rush him. There was time when they stood in line and they got close to him.
Yeah. I love, a couple weeks ago we were talking about Jesus as interruptible. Yeah. Sometimes I feel like I can't interrupt him, like he's too busy for me. I think that's something that we carry with us as humans. Why don't you turn to the people around you and just kind of discuss it. How in every single daily life, your devotions, your time in the Word, your time in prayer, how can you pursue being in awe of Jesus? So we'll reconvene in a couple minutes and pass the mic around.
Here, I'll move up.
Some of us believe Christ died, resurrected, and he's coming again.
We can bring it back together. Would anyone like to share or volunteer somebody from their group without their consent to share? Awesome. Or deodorant, it's okay.
Is it on?
Yeah,
All
it's
right.
on.
So I had this analogy that I think helps to put this in context a little bit, which is that, having awe is about perspective, right? And an example of that is you can look through a picture book of like Half Dome in Yosemite, and you can think, wow, that's a really cool picture. That's a really cool place. But I actually climbed Half Dome once, and I went to the very, very top, and I laid on my stomach, and I stuck my head over the edge, and I looked a mile straight down. And it took literally all the air out of my lungs. I was paralyzed with fear at that moment, and in the sense of just being awe and respectful of where I was. And so that awe and respect, I could never get that by just looking at a picture book, or looking at a picture of Half Dome. Unless I was there, I would have never had that real understanding of that. And so when it comes to God, it can be the same way. Like you were just saying, we can read through the Bible for distance, and it's interesting, and it's like, not that we don't like it. I mean, it's nice, but I don't know that it produces in us that awesome respect of who God is. And so how do you actually get that, And I was thinking, even in this story, these people were coming to Jesus with their physical problems, but Jesus came to earth to die for their sins. And think about what it must have been like for Jesus to think they should be asking me to forgive them of their sins, knowing that I'm God, but they're not. They're just focused on getting rid of their pain or their circumstance, which he, in his compassion, was able to do. And so the question for us then is, how do you get that awesome respect or that awe of God? And it makes me think of David, who sat in the fields when he was with the sheep, and he looked out at the stars and he contemplated how big the universe was, how God knows every star by name, how he knows the number of hairs on your head, how, you start thinking about the complexity of God and the incredible understanding and who he is. That helps to produce the awe. When you sit in wonderment of him and his creation. And I think sometimes we are very looking down at the sidewalk in front of our steps, just making sure we don't fall. But we lose that perspective because of the nature of our life is so tailored towards purpose-filled tasks rather than really thinking about who God is.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes even when we do our quiet time, we spend way too much thinking about the Bible and the words and not just sitting in stillness before the Lord and just being overwhelmed by who he is. I mean, that I think is a practice that maybe monks or other people do that kind of thing, but we as Christians maybe don't do enough of it to meditate before the Lord and think about who he is.
I like that. Thanks. I too, I've never climbed Half Dome, but I've driven into. Has everybody been to Yosemite? Anybody not been to Yosemite? When you come around and you get a glimpse of that valley, my first response is, you're almost like, how is it real? Like the depth and the perspective seems so off because everything is just so much bigger than anything you've ever seen. It's a great illustration. Somebody else want to share? We'll take one more. I'm going to pass it down to David Avinas right behind you. He beat you to the hand raise. Yeah. Yeah. When you're going to play Jeopardy, you got to be quick on the button.
Think of God. We know God is love. One of the greatest examples and one of the most emotional examples and realization of God's love is when, if you recall, the first time you held your child or your grandchild when they were 5 minutes old. The only emotion that you can have at that time is realizing this miracle. This is a living miracle of God's love. It's a miracle because it's a miracle that God is trusting us with new life. That in itself is a miracle. It's the greatest expression, the most powerful expression that we receive at that moment, realizing God created life. and we're holding it in our hands. And he's given us, because he loves us, the ability to hold that child and take the responsibility for that child's life in our hands. That's the awe of God saying, life is good, I created it, and it's good, and I want you to be part of it.
Yeah.
That is an amazing expression of God. It's one of the most powerful evidences of God's love. You feel it, and you feel it to the depths that you never forget that. And if we go back and think of those moments, the first time holding your son in your hand, you remember it right now as it was. And that is the greatest remembrance of God's love and what he's given for us.
Yeah. David, you can just flip the switch on the bottom, and then when we're ready to pass it, you can pass from there. Yeah. Both of those ring true. I think in my own life, I think sometimes when I'm too busy looking forward, I'm like the guy who wants to check the boxes and go, go, go. I feel like when I look backwards and realize, oh my goodness, what God saved me from, I feel like sometimes that's I can't remember who coined the phrase, but it's sometimes we have to know the bad news to understand the good news. And it sounds kind of dark and depressing, but sometimes when I sit and I actually think like, what are your sins? And I start to think of it, my reaction is like, oh boy. Especially when we start reading Matthew and Jesus is like, hey, surprise, if you've hated a brother or said something mean, you're guilty of murder. Like when those things start to come, I think his desire is for you to come to the realization of sin so that your reaction to what he's done for you is awe. So I would encourage you to continue to think about those sorts of things before we get towards Easter. Yeah.
Something I was kind of inspired to do by Anne Graham Lotz. You can go on YouTube, I think, and hear it, Just Give Me Jesus. And so something I do when I'm feeling overwhelmed or, I will just like call out all of the attributes of God.
Yeah.
And, just because it always makes me realize, that he is sovereign, he is everything, and it really makes a difference. Sorry, I forgot about that rule.
Joanna's saying you're good. There's little mics up here that kind of work, but you're good. No, I'm following with you. I don't know if you guys follow the podcast that we do, but Don Granger actually printed out a whole bunch of those, and he literally read the Bible from cover to cover and wrote down every statement of the character of God. And I actually think we have some copies floating around the desk if you want to add that to your collection. Let's keep pushing forward. We're going to be in verse 32. I think we have some pretty interesting things to dive into here. Now you will recall just a few weeks ago, Jesus sat down and his disciples came to him and said, Jesus, you better dismiss this crowd. They're going to get hangry and turn on us. You remember that? And Jesus says, you give them something to eat. So that happened, at least how Matthew has laid it out not that long ago. So we come to verse 32, and then this happens. Then Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and they have nothing to eat. So I literally think the Bible is saying that these people have just kind of upped and left what they were doing and followed him for 3 straight days. And I think how it's describing it, the way that I understand it, is maybe they packed some food, anticipating we might be following this guy for a little while, but maybe not anticipating 3 days, so they ran out of food. So there's no food to eat. And he says, and I am unwilling to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way. And the disciples said to him, where are we to get enough bread in such a desolate place to feed such a great crowd? Short-term memory loss is a thing. I think this is just, I think Matthew wants us to laugh. Go ahead and laugh a little bit. He just fed 5,000, and he's looking like, you already saw me feed 5,000. This is only 4,000. This should be, only 80% of the heavy lifting I did just a couple days ago. And Jesus said to them, well, how many loaves do you have? This is me reading the tone in. And they said, 7 and a few small fish. In directing the crowd to sit down on the ground, he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds, and they all ate and were satisfied. I would underline that phrase, were satisfied. We're going to come back to that in a second. I'll give you a little teaser. That term does not necessarily mean that they're no longer hungry, which is very fascinating. Their satisfaction, if it was just simply they were hungry and they're no longer hungry, has some other words that would be much easier to use in the Greek language. And they took up 7 baskets full of broken pieces left over. Those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. And after sending away the crowds, he got into the boat and he went to the region of Magadan. Interesting story. Why does Matthew, the Bible tells us that if you wanted to share every story and all the miracles that Jesus did, it would fill an entire library and just keep going, right? So why does Matthew decide that he wants to tell us this story again? It seems awfully repetitive, doesn't it? I think this story is not just about the miraculous power of Jesus, it's also about the disciples. And the disciples are kind of alternating between these great moments of clarity. Do you remember they were on the lake, and Jesus comes walking on the water? Remember this scene? And Peter walks on the water, then he gets in the boat, and what do? You truly are the Son of God, right? Clarity moment. They've seen him feed 5,000. They proclaim, oh my gosh, this is the Son of God. They've seen all these healings come, and this just happened back in verse 31. And they glorified the God of Israel. Very next story. A situation that's basically already happened. And these are their words. Where are we going to get enough bread? Like they just don't remember. So this is a moment of fogginess and the inability to see Jesus clearly. Now this sounds like a bunch of dumb disciples. But I think if you just pause and think, if we're just alternating moments of extreme clarity, and what's the technical opposite of clarity? I'm asking because it's not coming to mind. What is it? Yeah, confusion, yeah. Confusion, clarity, that's it. They're just alternating back and forth of these things. Now, instead of just saying, these are dumb disciples, this is hilarious, they don't get it, how many of us can just say that I have had moments of extreme clarity that God is who he says he is, I glorify him, I feel like there's no blinders on my eyes, I got it. And then the very next day you fall asleep and you wake up and you're like, oh man, I have no idea how I'm going to provide all the things I need in my life. I have no direction for my life. What am I going to do? Anybody felt that way before? Okay, so they're alternating back and forth and back and forth. I think Matthew wants to keep telling these stories because he doesn't want us to say, oh, those dumb disciples, those stupid disciples, they just never get it. I think Matthew wants to tell it enough where we realize, well, I'm kind of like that too. Do you notice that every time Matthew talks about the Pharisees, it's often the same exact stuff over and over and over? Don't you think he could just tell it to us 1 or 2 times and then like, okay, we get it. They have beef with him. They don't like him. They want to maintain their power, and we get it. Or maybe he's saying it over and over and over so that we don't say, those stupid Pharisees, they just don't get it. And instead we realize if we're not careful, we can become like them. So I think this is in part what Matthew is doing. Okay, so we got to remember that just 1 chapter ago, chapter 14, he fed 5,000. The next thing that we should be thinking of is this idea that we're on a mountain where Jews especially, and we know Matthew is written largely to a Jewish audience, on a mountain is where you meet with God, the God of Israel, right? And what is the most famous meeting on a mountain? Moses. Okay, so we have this idea, and I think Will touched on it, and I've chatted about this a handful of times, that a lot of what Jesus is doing throughout Matthew is kind of reliving Israel's history and even living into some of the things Moses did, but completing them, fulfilling them. So for instance, Jesus goes in the wilderness to be tempted by the devil for how long? 40 days. So it's almost like he's reliving the 40 years of Israel in the desert, but instead of being tempted and blowing it over and over and over, he goes out there and he completes all the temptations and he does not sin. Then he starts his earthly ministry and he goes outside of Israel to the Jordan River where they cross, and he goes through the water to start his ministry, sort of like Israel crossing the river to come into the promised land. So I think there's an element here of Moses and Jesus, and there's this interplay. So they're out in the desert, they're in the middle of nowhere, and Jesus is telling us that if they walk on their own to go find food, what's going to happen to them? They're going to faint. They're going to faint, and in the Old Testament lingo, they will grow faint and weary, right? And so I think there's an element of this going on, that Jesus begins multiplying bread. And if you go into the Exodus story, Exodus 16, who remembers Exodus 16? You guys been taking Sunday notes? The children of Israel get really hungry. They're going to grow faint and weary, and God provides what? Manna. And it's enough for one day, right? They can gather enough for the rest of the meals, and then they got to let it be, and then the next morning, more manna. Pretty cool story. Except every single day, they have to collect more. It's part of how it goes. When Jesus feeds these people who are hungry and growing faint and weary, what it says about them is that they all ate and were satisfied. This idea of satisfaction is that they are completely full, not just with food, but they are completely content with exactly where they're at. That Jesus is kind of the new Moses figure. Instead of being the go-between, he really is the Son of God. And so his one single meal makes them satisfied. They don't need another one. Is that cool? It's also the same idea of the living water. He says, I can give you lots of water from a well, and you're going to get thirsty again. Or I could tell you about living water. And what does the woman say? That sounds awesome. I don't want to come back and see the shame on all those ladies' eyes. For me, if I can drink one time and never get thirsty again, I want that. Okay, one other thing I think is important is Jesus empowers the disciples to do this miracle. He gives thanks, he blesses it, breaks the bread, and he starts giving it out, but he does it through the disciples. So the disciples are now these hands-on participants into the ministry of Jesus. So they don't get it. Where are we going to get the bread? And then he hands them the bread. And now they get to feed the people. I had this question with the 5,000. I don't think it's answered, and I don't think Matthew is trying to answer it. But my question is, if you're thinking about thousands of people, and Jesus says, hey, sit down, how many of you think that maybe these people have no idea a miracle even occurred? Just that bread and fish are arriving by the waiters right to them. It's totally, entirely possible. I think there's an emphasis that Jesus is performing this miracle and handing it to the disciples, saying, you feed them. This is what I've called you to do. That's what you do. A couple other things. Let's talk about the number 7. The number 7 in the Bible is representative of what? Perfection. Completeness, fullness in every way, right? On the 7th day, God rested after seeing that everything was good and beautiful. It's not the rest where God kind of like distances himself and becomes unattached to what he's created and like, I need a day off of you people. It's this beautiful thing that's fully and completely who we are meant to be. And so it's the idea of Sabbath. So this idea of perfection. If you remember in the feeding of 5,000, how many basketfuls do they get? 12. There's one basketful for every disciple. And I imagine Jesus' response to this, it's not in the Bible, but it's my reading, is kind of a wink and a nod. Like, you doubted it, now you not only have enough, but you each get a full basket, each one of you. Now, I think what Jesus has done is there's 7 basketfuls. So what does 7 basketfuls of food that satisfies represent? The perfect satisfaction. That when you eat Jesus' meal, there's a perfect satisfaction. I think on the last page of your outline, I think I wrote it in here, but if you just wanted a really cool study, we're going verse by verse, and so it doesn't always work out well. But if you wanted to just do like a study in the Bible, I would highly encourage you to go through Matthew. Go on Bible Gateway or whatever if you need some help with finding the terms. Track every single time Matthew talks about bread, leaven, yeast, crumbs, anything relating to bread. Look all of it up and then track it and see if you can find a theme. The theme ends with a meal where Jesus again takes bread and breaks it. It's beautiful. It's really beautiful. Okay, the last thing that I just think is really interesting is this town Magadan. This is where Jesus is going on the boat. Excuse me. Most scholars say Magadan is another name for Migdal. That they're the same thing. They're either the same thing or they're like two neighboring villages right next to each other. But this has not a lot to do with our Bible study tonight, but I just started looking it up because I wanted to know what this place was. This place was a huge fish processing area. So basically you could bring your catch and they would process your fish for you. It's kind of a big business around the Sea of Galilee. But a handful of years ago, an archaeological dig there discovered something really cool. It's the oldest known synagogue, the oldest one. It's the oldest known one. That was there, complete, very obvious from carvings, but what they found, which is really fascinating, is they found a carving of a menorah. Menorah is, the candle. The actual menorah was in the temple in Jerusalem, but there was a carving of it that was pretty much complete. And it was complete in a way that gave these people insight into what the original menorah actually looked like, which is cool because they didn't entirely know. The other fascinating thing is Hanukkah, which is where the menorah comes from, didn't happen until the 160s BC. And so this is like right around Jesus' time. This is the complete oldest synagogue, right where he's hanging out in Matthew chapter 15. Isn't that cool? So he probably laid foot in that synagogue. Just kind of fascinating, and they just discovered it, and it's there. Very cool. There's a question down here. I want to push us forward for time, but if you wanted to jot down some notes for yourself, it's the idea of beyond just a physical meal, what are some of the stories in your life where God has completely satisfied you? I'm going to pause for a drink. Anybody have a question or any insight? You know they do that in the movies, like a rock star comes out and then someone throws a mic and they just grab it. I literally thought about that and then I thought that I would miss it and it would like hit me in the teeth or something. Yeah, like I'm with you on that, but also when these people are like positive that they're going to jump off the stage to crowd surf, like where do they get the confidence that they're going to be caught? Anybody ever thought of that? Just came to my mind.
It's been practiced.
It's been practiced?
Yes.
Oh. I guess if you hit the deck really hard, you would know, like, we're not that big of a band yet. Like, we're just not good. We're not good enough. Okay, we are jumping into chapter 16. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees came. If you're just taking notes, I would do a circle around the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We're going to come back to this in a second. The Pharisees and the Sadducees came, and to test him, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. And he answered them, "When it is evening, you say, 'It will be fair weather, for the sky is red.' And in the morning, it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah." So he left them and he departed. Anybody else confused? I spent way too much trying to figure this out. I sometimes get irritated with Jesus because they say, "We're here to test you. Can you give us a sign?" I feel like, Jesus, why can't you just say no? and then leave. Because I could underline that and tell everyone what that means. So here's what he says. They come to him. The first thing we need to point out is this. I think I put a footnote. I never, ever noticed this. This is like brand new to me as of like Sunday night. The Pharisees and the Sadducees. You see how Matthew bulks them together? First century readers and listeners know that these two groups of people do not belong together. These two groups of people do not like each other. They are competing for power and prestige and influence over who runs the temple and who gets to interpret the law. These two groups of people do not go together. And because I'm not a first century Jew, I never picked that up. So all of a sudden, Matthew says, and then the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and he's presenting them as like a unified front, which they are absolutely 100% not. The only other time in Matthew where these two groups of people have showed up together is in chapter 3. And it happens when they catch wind that there's a guy that's a wild man down on the river, and he's preaching the kingdom of heaven and baptizing people for the repentance of their sins. And it says they catch wind that the crowds are getting really big, so the Pharisees and Sadducees show up to have a face-off with John the Baptist. This is the only other time so far. To be honest with you, I don't know if they appear again together like this. They show up to see John. And why do they show up together to see John? Even though they dislike each other, they have a unified front against John. What is it? The crowds are following him. He's getting more likes on Instagram than them, right? He's getting famous. He's getting big enough crowds where all of a sudden he might have some authority and some influence. And even though these two groups of people are fighting over authority and influence themselves, they can both agree that, hey, let's set our conflict on the back burner. Let's just go make sure John the Baptist doesn't take any of what we're fighting over. So that's the first time. The second time they show up is right now. It's when people are brought to Jesus and he doesn't have to say a word, and they look at him, see what he does, and says, "You are the God of Israel." And now, dun dun dun, they show up together. They are a unified front. Why are they unified now? The lights are coming on. The influence, the crowds. You know, it's no longer like a handful of people in a village. It's now 5,000 plus women and children. It's in the thousands, the tens of thousands. Even people who aren't following him, now the word has gotten out where he just crosses across the lake. Remember this? He crosses across the lake and there's already 1,000 people waiting for him, right? So they're saying, this is going to be a problem. We need to be unified against this guy. So they come to him and they ask for a sign from heaven. It seems like an innocent question. Throughout the Old Testament, this, I put some examples here. This happens in Exodus chapter 17. We actually read this scripture on a Sunday morning. Basically, the Old Testament says that when you test God, that is a terrible thing. That's how you instigate God's wrath, that you put God to the test. Remember, Satan actually has this. It's the same language. Satan takes Jesus to the top of the temple. And what does he tell him? If you jump, your angels will catch you, right? And what is Jesus' response? You shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Why? Because putting the Lord your God to the test throughout Jewish history is the recipe for invoking his wrath and his anger. And so they come, and I think one of the reasons Jesus kind of reacts this way is because these are the people who are supposed to know that. These are the people who are supposed to know that you don't put the Lord your God to the test. So either number one, they're trying to instigate God's anger, or number two, which I think, is that they already don't recognize Jesus as God, and they're not willing to even open themselves up to that possibility, or else they wouldn't test him. Does that make sense? These are the people who have seen him perform miracles and then turn around and said, yeah, I saw him perform a miracle. He does it by the power of Beelzebub, the prince of demons. That's how he does it. And Jesus is like, did you guys finish Philosophy 101? That makes no sense, right? So they come and they say, well, give us a sign. And Jesus says, what turns out to be actually like pretty common. You can just type it into Google. I had no idea what this meant. But basically, first century meteorologists, I don't know if they exist or what, but it's understood that at sunset, when the sun is going down, when the sky is red, this is a moment to pause and see the beauty of the sky. This is a good thing. This is beautiful. This is how you end your day. Kind of like when you go down to the beach and you see a beautiful sunset. However, when you wake up in the morning and you can see that the clouds are rolling in and the sunrise is already turning the sky red, you know that there's bad, nasty weather, and you better get to work really quickly to make sure you make arrangements for that. So he says, you guys know that, but everyone knows that. Then he says, you know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you can't interpret the sign of the times. You can't even look around and see what's right in front of your face. Then he says, an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign. I think they're called evil because they refuse to accept what's right in front of them. They do things like see Jesus perform a miracle and then turn around and say Satan's demons gave him power to do that. And they're adulterous because these are the people who, in their vows, are married to the Torah. These are the people who their great loyalty should be to God's law and God's prophets as written in the Holy Scriptures. And they're not even faithful to what it says. So requesting a sign is kind of a sign of arrogance and pride. It's this pessimism and insistence that if you're really God, you should have to prove it to me. Again, I think this is an element of being able to see all the miracles in the world and your jaw hitting the floor, but nothing happening in your heart. And so he says, again, this is the second time. He says, the only sign that's going to be given to you is the sign of Jonah. It's very interesting, the way that he's posing this. Let's walk this through. Jonah is called by God to get up and go to Nineveh. It's this wicked, nasty, terrible city, right? Jonah goes into the belly of the whale for how long? 3 days. Okay, so there's a sense of the sign that Jesus is going to be gone in the belly of the whale for 3 days before he reemerges. So we're talking about the resurrection. But he says, the sign of Jonah is also this. Jonah finally gets puked out of that whale fish, right? He finally goes to Nineveh. And do you guys remember the story? It's only 4 chapters long, I think. The illustration is like Nineveh is this giant city. And he's sort of like half, you-know-what's it. And he walks in and he's like, hey, you guys should all repent or you're all getting destroyed. Oh, checked off the box, God. I did what you wanted me to. And then what does he do? He goes and he makes this like super cool lazy boy shelter up on a mountain so he can watch God blow the place up. Except somebody catches wind of this and they realize, oh my gosh, that's a serious thing. And the word gets out, and the king of Nineveh repents, and then all of a sudden the whole city is in sackcloth and ashes. Remember that? And they're repenting of their sin. Jonah, meanwhile, is up on the mountain, and God kills the vine that gives him shade, and then he's all angry with God, and he's angry with the people, and he's angry that he smells like fish guts, right? He's just angry at the whole thing. And instead of saying like, oh my gosh, God, I totally like mailed that in, and you still did a miracle, he's just got this hardened heart. So I think there's an element of what Jesus is saying is you guys are worse than Nineveh. Nineveh heard this half-hearted version of this and they accepted it. You have it right in front of your face and you still won't. So here's the sign. Jonah has already come, told you to repent, and you're not going to do it. The final sign is that I will be gone for 3 days and I will reemerge. And that's the sign. Very interesting. Oh, this is cool. This is a quote from a commentary I was reading this week. This is from Stanley Hauerwas, who you've probably seen me quote a fair bit. He says, we are too often captured by the assumption that the way things are is the way things have to be. Pharisees and Sadducees read the daily newspapers and then just adjust accordingly. Followers of Jesus must read the same papers to show why Jesus offers an alternative reading of the times than that offered by the New York Times. That's a good quote, huh? I think what he's saying is you should be aware of what's happening in the world, so that you could say, oh, that's how you think this has got to be? Let me tell you about Jesus, because there's a better way. Jesus has a better way for you to understand this. The reason the world is, going to hell in a handbasket is because it is. That's why it's happening, because of sin and brokenness, but Jesus offers a way out. And so instead of just saying, oh, the world's going terrible, let's see, how could we team up with our enemies to consolidate our power and keep our authority? You say, God, I wonder what you have in store for me to bring light into a dark place. They're two very different things. Okay, let's see. I want to make sure we have time. Oh yeah, we got plenty of time. Verse 5. When the disciples reached the other side, they had forgotten to bring any bread. They must have eaten the 7 basketfuls by now. I think there's I don't know how to, I wish I was good at drawing. I think there's this element that we are led by our stomach. Is that sort of true? I don't say this out of any pride or anything. I occasionally take a day to fast, and I got to tell you that around like mid-afternoon, I start daydreaming about breaking it at dinner time. Like, wait a second, I'm not supposed to be daydreaming about that. I'm supposed to be praying. Like, this is something God's working out of me. Because we're so led by our like carnal needs, right? As long as I can breathe, and as long as I have some water, my next thing is I just want to eat. I'll eat everything, right? These disciples are the same. They relate with us. So they're going to the other side of the lake and they realize, oh no, we forgot bread. They've forgotten again that they're hanging out with the guy who can just make bread happen. And Jesus said to them, watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The leaven. Bill, you might have to fill me back in on the leaven here in a second. And they began discussing it among themselves, saying, we brought no bread. Busted, he totally caught us. He's probably going to get hungry and mad too, right? But Jesus, aware of this, said, oh, you of little faith, why are you discussing among yourselves that you brought no bread? Do you not yet perceive? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many baskets you gathered? How is it that you fail to understand that I did not speak about bread? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Okay, I'm going to do my best to tell you what I see, but I'm not sure I'm going to explain it well. I want you to notice that Jesus says the exact same thing 2 times. Do you notice that Jesus doesn't explain it to them? He says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Then they have this whole thing about, oh no, we forgot bread. And Jesus is like, do you not remember? Basically, he says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They immediately react with their stomach. Then Jesus says, this has nothing to do with bread. Just as a reminder, I can make bread if you get hungry. Don't worry. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Then they get it, right? As soon as Jesus nixes one of the explanations for what's happening, they realize, oh, well, if it's not about our hunger and our bread, oh, he's talking about the teaching because I've heard this teaching before. Do you remember that? Sometimes our kind of carnal, fleshly desire gets in the way of just a really simple connecting point A to point B. We're like, here's point A, here's point B, and here's point hunger. And we're like going to point B, and then we're like, I'm going to go this way, right? And that happens. How many of you have ever like gone to go do something, and then you're like, I'll have a cookie, and then you're like, I can't even remember what I was doing here, right? I think that's what's happening. And Jesus is like, oh, no, this isn't it. And they're like, oh, yeah, I do remember after all. I've actually already heard this teaching, and you've already explained it to me. But this need and this desire about us gets in the way. I actually think that this is at the core of why we're told to fast. Because I think when we fast, we begin to realize that man does not live on bread alone, right? It doesn't say that man doesn't need to eat, because that would get dangerous if you just stopped doing that altogether, right? But I think what Jesus is saying is you can eat a good meal, that will be wonderful, but it will not satisfy you like the bread of life, which is me. And so I think part of what fasting is all about is getting under control the human instinct and the desire of the flesh and start to kind of like put a chain around it and saying, it doesn't control me. By the power and the blood of Jesus, Jesus can deal with that, and I can move beyond my own instinct to want those things all the time. And now I am opening myself up to things that Jesus wants for me. Okay, so they forget to bring their bread. This is, again, another example. Matthew loves to talk about bread, bread, bread. So he says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So the idea is, we talked about this before, that you can't really just you can't just like throw bread together. It's one of the reasons in Exodus that when you eat unleavened bread, part of the reason they're told to eat unleavened bread is this sense of urgency. You don't have time to sit and wait for it to rise, right? So the leavened bread idea is you got a chunk of dough, and it's already been rising, and it's ready to get baked or whatever you're going to do with it. And so you just pull a chunk off, and you add it to the new dough, and then you wait for the chemical process. Is that right, Bill? Did I get it? Bill told me last time that technically you can just leave it out in the sun, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know anything about bread. I like to eat it. I do know about that. So the idea is that you would take something that's from the old. I think part of this leaven idea is taking something from the old, like the Old Testament or the old way of thinking, or probably the Old Covenant, and adding it to the new is actually going to make it very difficult for you to understand what Jesus is doing, because over time the chemical process is going to permeate the whole dough, and once that has happened, there's no going back in there and separating the two. I think it's the exact same illustration, more or less, of you don't put new wine in old wineskins, right? The idea is that the new and the old will corrupt one another in a way that you won't quite perceive and understand what Jesus is doing. So I think what Jesus is doing is saying, be careful of their teaching. Why? Because it comes prepackaged with all the stuff you guys have been witnessing. They're pessimistic. They're negative. They are authoritarian. They want to keep their power and their influence even above obedience and faithfulness to God. And all that stuff comes packaged in their teaching. And if that gets in you, it will be impossible to get it out. So he says, beware of those things. Again, I think this is just hilarious. They literally just got kind of put in their place, like, hey, where are we going to get bread to feed all the people? And now they're thinking, where are we going to get bread to feed ourselves? And so he says to them, "O you of little faith, do you not perceive? Do you not remember?" Their physical need is getting in the way of understanding a deep spiritual truth. I love that Jesus says this. He uses this word. I'm noticing that as we study on Sundays and we're going through the book of Exodus, how many things throughout Exodus just show up in Matthew? You guys notice that? What is something that Exodus just says over and over and over? Every time the people are going to transition from one thing to the other, what does God always tell them? Remember what kind of stuff? Remember what I've done for you. Remember, you were just slaves in Egypt. I heard you. I came up with the plan and I got you out, right? Remember, you were in the desert. You were wandering around hungry and aimless. I gave you direction. I gave you water out of a rock. I gave you quail because you swore that you needed protein, right? And then I gave you manna. All of these things. I gave you direction. I gave you such a detailed law of the ins and outs of how I created you that there's nothing left to question. Remember that I did all of those things. And this is what Jesus says. He says, did you not understand that I did not speak about bread? Wait, what am I looking through here? I lost my place. That's okay, we'll just keep going on. Flip my page here. So he repeats it again, and then immediately when they realize it's not about hunger and bread, they get it. We're going to stop here for the night. We'll pick up at verse 13 next week while your cars are getting washed squeaky clean. But as we wrap up, any questions, any thoughts? Yeah, John.
I just had a thought about when he fed the thousands and they were satisfied. Mm-hmm. Is it possible that part of the miracle was to have the people satisfied for the amount of food that they ate?
Yeah, I think food has something to do with it, that they're hungry and God meets their need, for certain. But I think it goes beyond just we were hungry and now we're not hungry. In fact, let's pause for a second, because Jesus says something to them that I think we maybe brushed over. Before he performs the miracle of feeding, he says he commands them to do what? Sit down. It's kind of a... When somebody tells you to sit down, what's kind of the insinuation? Relax. We're not going anywhere. You can take a deep breath. Pause. When a whole bunch of strangers who are all following Jesus and they're hyper-focused on Jesus are told, sit down. And they start sitting down, what do they start to do with each other? Talk. Hey, how did you hear about Jesus? Where'd you come from? Right? And so there's this element of fellowship. And then you're sitting and you're talking and you're making some new friends, but your stomach's grumbling, and all of a sudden a trusty disciple shows up with bread and fish for you, right? And now what happens? What happens when you just sit around and eat a meal with people? You're happy, you laugh, you tell stories, you figure out where your common ground is, right? This is, as basically every scholar points out, this is the beginning root of what church is. You know, we sometimes think, oh, we built a building and we got a 501c3 or whatever it is, and now we're an official business, right? That's not what a church is. A church is an affiliation of people that have all sorts of different interests and skills and abilities, and at the core of it, the only thing they actually need to have in common is their love and pursuit of Jesus, and then everything else is for naught, right? And so they sit down. And they share a meal together. I think it's why Jesus says, every time you gather, do this in remembrance of me. Eat. Sometimes we think of the communion table and we think, do it in remembrance of me. It's heavy duty, right? The lights are dimmed and there's piano in the background. I think Jesus is envisioning a meal where people are gathered and they're laughing and they're saying, oh my gosh, I remember this is a gift of God to us, that we get to laugh and be together. Why? Because even though we don't have that much in common, the blood and the body of Jesus was sacrificed for you and for me, and that's the greatest commonality that we could possibly share. And that's it. So I think that's what the satisfaction is. I don't know about you, but I could be very hungry and go through the drive-thru at In-N-Out and be very not hungry quickly. I wouldn't call myself satisfied. Now I could get In-N-Out and sit with 5 or 6 good friends and talk about things that matter, and I would describe that as satisfied. Any other thoughts or questions?
I still don't understand. Beware of leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. What exactly does that mean again?
Yeah.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, they say at the end, let me flip it over there. The disciples say at the end, they realize that he's talking about, sorry, my pages are sticking together here. But the teaching of the Pharisees. So the leaven is like the teaching. And the leaven is, I think the visual is something small that gets into a larger batch, and then over time, how leaven and chemical works, it begins to permeate the whole dough. So you can no longer see the difference between the two. So I think the warning is that the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees is if you get it in you and you accept it, it will be very difficult for you to understand who Jesus is and what Jesus is doing. Does that make sense? Okay, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Anything we can be praying for anyone? don't we wrap up this way? Why don't you turn seated, kind of like Jesus commanded us? Why don't you just pray with each other? If your comfort level is you just assign someone to pray over you and be done, that's great. If you feel like God's stretching you and you want to get 3 or 4 people all to pray, but why don't we pray as small groups, and then we can just, as your group finishes up, we will just dismiss from there.
Thank you.